Welcome to Take or Give, the podcast where we give you a backstage pass to the aid and international development sector and explain exactly how it works beyond what you see in the news headlines or on TV and in social media.
I'm Lauriane, founder and director of the advocacy team.
And I'm Alex, an independent researcher, facilitator and actor, and we are your co-hosts. So welcome to Series 1 of the podcast, where we have broken down aid and development by busting key myths about the sector. So this is our final episode of Series 1, which is a bit sad, Lauriane. I think we've been on quite a journey. So we've looked back and we've talked about what reparations for slavery rather than foreign aid could look like. But then we also looked at the present and how money and power really still are concentrated in the hands of a very small number of countries and organizations. Not much has changed there. And we've also looked ahead a little bit to what development could look like if it were transformed.
Yeah, we've done our absolute best to bring you three speakers who were really well placed to help us to explore and bust the three key myths that we've been talking about across the series, and that we found across our careers are the most frequently cited myths about the international aid and development. So thinking back to myth one, which was that countries that receive aid are entirely responsible for their own problems. And we talked about this myth with Marcus Ryder, who is the author of The Big Payback, alongside Sir Lenny Henry. And Marcus had no time for this myth. He said very clearly and eloquently that idea is patently false, that clearly historical atrocities like slavery, like colonialism, massively contribute to the situation that countries that receive aid find themselves with, alongside some of the modern day injustices, whether that's related to the way that the international trade systems operate, or the way that Western capitals like London, Geneva and others have set up financial systems that move money, often in the form of tax evasion and other forms of corruption that really harms those countries.
Yeah, and I have to say, because you might not mention it, Lauriane, because you're very modest, that your organization, the advocacy team, has done some absolutely incredible research on the practicalities of reparations, and you partnered with an incredible organization called Development Reimagined. You must read the report. We'll link to that in the description below so that you can check it out.
Thanks, Alex.
So then we dove into myth 2, and I have to say this is the myth that personally gets me the most, which is that aid money goes directly to the people who need it the most. So because most people who have no involvement in aid or international development or anything like that, they actually really believe this to be true. This is what I've found in my experience in my career. So we outlined in that episode that, look, there are instances, of course, where money goes to buy things that will directly end up in the hands of, people who need maybe medical supplies, things like vaccines. We talked a bit about Hurricane Melissa in Jamaica and the devastating effects of that. There might be supplies going to help people to support and cope with the effects of that. But by and large, what we outlined in that episode is that there are huge sums of money, we're talking billions, that are going to organizations from the donor countries, from the countries that are supposed to be giving the aid. And they're ending up in some cases with over 90% of that funding. So that's really an issue that we want to call out. And it's definitely not a coincidence. Numbers like that simply cannot be a coincidence. So in the case of civil society organizations, and we covered this briefly, but every country has them. They're basically charities, non-profits, rather than government bodies or companies, They're the organizations on the ground in countries all around the world doing incredible work. They're doing the hard work, the real work. So you'd expect them to get most of the money, right? That makes logical sense. Well, wrong, because of all the money that's given to civil society from these donor countries in the global north or in the west, only 1% of that is given directly to the organizations in these countries to spend on the issues that they think are most important. How can this make sense? Well, our incredible guest, Eshban Kwasiga, he basically gave us a completely eye-opening perspective on this. And he talked about this as one of the best kept secrets in development. And I have to agree with him. So what we think on this podcast is that a figure like that, a discrepancy like that, really needs to be interrogated. We need to understand what are the driving forces behind it.
everyone who listens to this podcast to understand exactly what this looks like in practice. So imagine for a moment that you are the development minister of a rich country, and you've seen, as is the case, that across the north in a town, let's say Doncaster, there are families who are struggling with the cost of living, and you want to use your country's aid budget to support those families. But instead of going to find an organization in Doncaster to fund, you decide that you are going to send this money via an organization in, say, Djibouti. So you find a charity in Djibouti, you give that charity in Djibouti the funding, and you say to the charity in Djibouti, hey, we want you to help us to reach and support families in Doncaster who are struggling with the cost of living. Now, bear in mind, this charity in Djibouti may not speak English. They may never have been to Doncaster. They may have no experience of the cultural context of Doncaster, the humour, the sensitivities, the way people like to receive help and support in Doncaster. But the funding goes through them. That is the status quo that we are talking about here.
Yeah, that's a great example, Ariane. And honestly, I can't think of a single city, town or village in the UK, certainly not Doncaster, that would accept an arrangement like that. So why would we expect anybody else to? And just in case we haven't convinced you enough, we want to give you one more statistic, because numbers do matter. So most importantly, previous estimates have shown that so-called poor countries, right, take in roughly $2 trillion in resource transfers. What does that mean? That means money coming in, including foreign aid, but other types of money as well. So that's $2 trillion coming in. And how much flows back out of them in the same year? You'd expect, hopefully, a lot less than 2 trillion. No, I'm afraid it's 5 trillion. So that's literally countries that are supposed to be benefiting from foreign aid actually giving $3 trillion more back to the so-called donor countries. And so what are these outflows? It's really complicated, but to summarize it, a lot of it is debt. Huge amounts of debt that has been placed on countries in the global south. And then illicit financial flows again that Lauriane talked about. So that basically different forms of corruption, including tax evasion by companies, but other things as well, and much more. So it really begs the question, Lauriane, who is developing who?
Good question, Alex. And then we went on to myth 3, which was the international development sector is woke. And we had the opportunity to talk to Sarah Champion. Sarah Champion is a member of parliament in the UK, and she chairs an important committee of MPs who look at international development and who scrutinise the aid budget. Back in 2021, that committee conducted an inquiry looking at racism in the aid sector, and we had an opportunity to talk to Sarah about what was the follow-up to the findings of that inquiry and what can we expect to see going forward.
And I think, Lauriane, what's really important about that episode, but also the inquiry that you talked about, is that it wasn't you or me or anyone else coming to the spontaneous conclusion that the international development sector is racist. Those words are written in a document that was authored by the UK Parliament, the UK government. And that's something that we should all take really seriously, I think.
Yeah, a committee of MPs scrutinised the issue. And I encourage everyone to really look at that report and really see their findings.
And that's a recap. We've covered so much ground, Lauriane, and it has been incredible. We thought maybe we'd take a moment, though, to look forward. So if you had to guess, Lauriane, what does the future of aid and development look like in the coming months or years?
I think if you had asked that question at any other time in the last 5 years, I would say it likely looks very similar to what it looks like now. I think now we really are at an inflection point. I don't have any predictions for what it will look like. I think the status quo is very strong and it could continue with some changes around the margins, or as we heard in episode 4, perhaps those movements and communities that are trying to build a different system, maybe that will grow in prominence, and those movements will be supported. So I no predictions from me, but for sure we are at an inflection point. And it's an interesting moment because things are not black and white. And just to illustrate that, I want you to listen to some recent remarks from Secretary of State Rubio, who explains what the current way in which global health is funded. And remember, as you do, that example we shared with you about Doncaster and Djibouti. Listen.
The United States has spent billions of dollars over the years in helping with health strategies all across the world. What we learned over time, and especially after coming here, is that oftentimes, and I'm oversimplifying it, but this is an accurate description, what would happen is we would go to a country and say, we're going to help you with your health care needs. Then we would drive over to Northern Virginia somewhere, find an NGO, one of these organizations, give them all the money, tell them go to this country and do their health care program for them. That NGO would then take about some percentage of that money for their overhead and administrative costs. And by the time it got down to it, the host country had very little influence. It was sort of imposed on them. And only a percentage of the overall money ever actually reached the patients and the people on the ground that we were trying to help because of these costs. This makes no sense. So why are we hiring American and international NGOs to go into other countries and run healthcare systems that are parallel and sometimes in conflict with the healthcare systems of the host country? If we're trying to help countries, help the country. Don't help the NGO to go in and find a new line of business.
So it seems Secretary Rubio somewhat agrees with our analysis, but I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. And what I would encourage everyone interested in this subject to do is to really look closely at both what the US government says and what they do in practice. Because we've talked in this series about the cuts that were announced. And those were very loud and big announcements. But quietly, the US government has been signing deals, aid deals with a number of countries to provide aid to support the country's global health systems. And Secretary Rubio is right. These have been direct agreements from one government to another. In development, we call that bilateral funding. Now, one of the countries who signed a deal is Kenya. And very recently, a court in Kenya ordered the suspension of at least part of that deal based on concerns about the privacy of patient data. So, famously, the president wrote The Art of the Deal. It seems that even development, even aid falls within the art of the deal. And I would encourage all of us who are interested in this to really study it closely.
Absolutely, Lorianne. Everyone get your little magnifying glasses out and follow along with us. And I think I would say, and I would add to that there's another really major set of players in the world of development we haven't really talked about much on this podcast at all, because honestly, it would have been way too long, which are philanthropic donors. So these are private foundations. And for the listeners, I think you'll have heard of at least some of them. For example, the Gates Foundation, which was founded by Bill and Melinda Gates, or in some cases, individual people like Mackenzie Scott. She was formerly married to Jeff Bezos, but is now giving away upwards of $26 billion to organizations around the world, actually in a very flexible and unrestricted way. So there's something to watch there. And also between 2019 and 2023, the Gates Foundation and lots of other foundations together provided a total of $57.3 billion in so-called aid. I mean, that's more than some governments give, right, Lorianne? So, and as we've talked about throughout the podcast, with money comes power. That's true of any sector. So I think it's an area to watch really closely.
Yeah, something else to watch. And Alex, I think it's fair to say that we've been hard in this podcast on the International Development Center or development sector. In fact, we've looked at some of the murky corners and we've tried to bring some of that to light. And I think it's right that we do that. But I don't want to end on a negative. So tell me, what is there anything that you're kind of makes you feel hopeful and optimistic about the future?
I think it's a really important question as we move into 2026, where so many incredibly tragic things are either happening or continuing to happen. So it's important to kind of answer your question, I think, which is that, well, listen, of course, it goes without saying that there are people and projects and initiatives that are doing really meaningful work in the development space around the world. That absolutely is true. You and I know a lot of them personally. So hello, if you're listening. But what we're doing in this podcast, I think, if we take a step back, is critiquing structures and ways of working, some of which have existed for hundreds of years. And we've talked about how those structures and certain individuals that we've already named are stopping change from happening. So with that said, one thing that gives me a lot of hope is that other ways of doing this already exist and have existed for a very long time. You were just speaking to that. And I'm going to give you an example, my absolute favorite example that I try to bring up as often as I can, feminist funds. So feminist funds are philanthropic organizations like the foundations I was just talking about a moment ago, but they operate completely differently to pretty much any other kind of organization out there, in the sense that what they do is they look for experts and people in their own contexts, in the Doncasters of the world, and they say, what do you need? So they start with the question, not with the answer. And I think there's something really powerful about that. And then they go on to give often huge amounts of flexible, long-term, so not just those 3-5-year projects we talked about, funding. And that I've seen that transform people, places, and countries in an incredible way. Gives me a lot of hope.
Okay, that's a great example, Alex. And mine would be similar. I think that I am inspired by the people and the initiatives that are growing at this moment, including people inside some of the big philanthropic and development agencies and organizations who are agitating internally and talking to their leadership about changing the way that they operate and operating in a way that is more that's fairer and that addresses some of the issues that we have talked about in the podcast to date. And we heard from 2 of our guests that there are movements that are growing. These are not necessarily the most well-resourced movements, but they're growing anyway. People are using what they have and they're pushing ahead. And as Marcus Ryder told us in episode 3, that we don't know how long it will take for those things to have an even bigger impact. We don't know how long it will take for, he said there's never a bad time to call for justice or to work towards justice. So we don't know what the outcome of some of these things are, but I'm inspired and encouraged by the people who are doing that work anyway. And hopefully the moments, the political moments where change can happen will open up. And when they do, there are lots of great ideas and lots of great initiatives that will be ready to take up some space.
Yeah, hear, hear. And cheers to all of those incredible change makers around the world.
And so on those positive notes, we're going to bring series 1 to a close. And I'm really sad to be bringing series 1 to a close.
Me
because
too.
We've really enjoyed producing this podcast, and we really hope that you've enjoyed listening.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been so much fun. But apart from having a really good time, which we have had, we really, really, really want this podcast to reach as wide an audience as possible. That's the whole reason that we've done it. And we want to keep challenging and busting those myths. So we really need your help. If anyone is actually listening, first of all, hello. Thank you for sticking with us. But please send smoke signals, carrier pigeons, or just a good old-fashioned DM. We need to hear from you. We really want your feedback so we can come back with even better content for series 2.
So for the final time, thank you for listening. You've been amazing.
And we've been Take or Give.